All right, and this is the title of our lecture. It is IVF as a Business. It will be presented by Dr. Sable, who's actually a legend in our field for his pioneering work on entrepreneurship. I thought it was interesting in reading his CV that he got his MD from the University of Pennsylvania. He did his residency in obstetrics and gynecology at New York Hospital, a fellowship in reproductive endocrinology and infertility at the Brigham and Women's. He was director of reproductive endocrinology and infertility after a stint at St. Barnabas, where he was from 1992 to 2003. He then became a healthcare analyst at Deutsche Bank in New York, and he currently is the portfolio manager for two different funds: for the Special Situations Life Sciences Fund in New York, that's from 2005 to present, and for Special Situations Life Sciences Innovation Fund in New York, and that's since last year. David is currently affiliated with Columbia University, where he teaches entrepreneurship in biotechnology. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. David Sable.
Okay. I gotta get my slides up. Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Paulson. Thank you, members of the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but about 2 miles from here, I sat in a basement lecture hall of the Medical Education Building at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, listening to Dr. Luigi Mastriani talk about assisted reproduction in IVF. You know, many people here knew Dr. Mastriani. Not surprisingly, after hearing him talk, I was hooked. And I had the privilege of practicing in our field for about 15 years. I started investing in the field in 1998, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share some observations as to where we are and what the future of IVF is, both as a business and in healthcare. Learning objectives. Now, normally we have one set of disclosures. Given what I do for a living, you can assume that I have conflicts of interest all over the place. I will not be mentioning any particular companies. Please don't construe anything I say as a recommendation to buy or sell stock. For the sake of the Securities and Exchange Commission, I also need to state that this is not a solicitation for investment into any investment funds. The agenda is, this will be we'll do a little bit looking back, but this is mainly a forward-looking lecture, talking about where IVF is as an industry and where it is as a business. So for our industry overview, it's really not true that IVF is an industry. It's more an industry in each individual country, where the combination of cultural factors, regulatory issues, and more than anything, out-of-pocket expense make it very, very different, make the industry reactive to what's going on in that country. But to understand it, we have to start from the top, which is we have 7.5 billion people in the world. We produce 130 million babies per year, and approximately 0.4%, or somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000, come from IVF. We do 2.5 million cycles to produce those 500,000 babies. About 750,000 in Europe, 750,000 in China, approaching 500,000 in Japan, and a little more than 250,000 in the United States. From the point of view of the patients themselves, they have between 5,000 and 6,000 IVF centers to choose from. And these centers vary from small, tiny, essentially closets doing a couple of dozen cycles, to mega clinics doing as much as 40,000 cycles in a single site. That's 100 cycles a day. That's a big program. Out-of-pocket expenses for these treatments from $0 to over $25,000 a cycle. And as chapter 2 of almost any economics textbook will imply, this will greatly affect the per capita usage of the technique. And indeed, if you go from Israel with one cycle for every 229 people, through Japan, slightly more, Spain, one cycle for 420, Europe about twice that, The USA, 1 for every 1,600. In China, 1 for every 2,400. The use of IVF is drastically different from one locale to the next. And the numbers that I would point you to are those last two numbers, the US and China, because that's going to be the first part where our disruption of this industry comes from. Now, looking back at the progress we've made in IVF, I started seeing patients as a third-year resident in 1988 in an infertility clinic. I started seeing first IVF patients a couple of years later as a first-year fellow. The most remarkable thing that we've done in the interim time is the implantation rate, the chance of having a baby for every embryo we put back, has risen remarkably, and the effectiveness and the safety of our procedure has gone along with it. When I first started seeing patients, very quickly we started getting calls from, for example, oncologists asking us if we could do something to preserve the fertility of young women. In 1988, we couldn't do that. We learned how. In the beginning, we were placing back 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever number embryos, usually day 2 embryos, hopefully 4 cells, usually quite fragmented, and hoping that something would stick. Of course, you put back that many embryos and the multiple pregnancy rate was unacceptably high. In the interim, we learned how to freeze embryos. We learned how to do ICSI. Overnight, we had an enormous patient group that went from, I'm sorry we don't treat the severest astheno-oligospermia, to, oh yeah, that's easy. We learned pre-implantation genetics. We learned oocyte vitrification. And most importantly, we improved the safety of this procedure by decreasing the multiple birth rate down to almost negligible and greatly decreasing ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. It seems remarkable now, but for a time it seemed like we always had somebody in-house, someone who was an inpatient. There was always the person that we were happy that she got pregnant, but worried that she was going to get severe hyperstimulation syndrome because of it. But in addition to these innovations, there's still some major challenges. And the greatest challenge now, as the greatest challenge was 10 years ago and 10 years before that, was access. Even in the infertility population, which is the group that we primarily have been using in vitro fertilization to treat, we are very underserved. And then there are other indications where IVF could provide tremendous amounts of good that those populations are virtually unserved, particularly the prevention of genetic disease population and the proactive fertility management patients, including oncofertility and the LGBTQ community. Digging down a little bit more into the unique characteristics of our field, looking at the intellectual underpinnings. Now, since I saw my last patient in 2004, I've studied a lot of different industries within healthcare. And one of the most interesting ways of stratifying healthcare sectors is the degree to which they're leveraging computing power, computer memory, massive storage, and the elucidation of the genome to travel along what we call the analog to digital continuum. When I was in med school, lung cancer was small cell lung cancer and non-small cell lung cancer. Today, we've taken cancers and we define them by specific single amino acid mutations or relative over and under activity of specific enzymes. Unfortunately, other areas haven't held up. Alzheimer's disease in the 1980s is Alzheimer's disease now. Very poorly characterized, and I know it when I see it. Pattern recognition, analog type diagnosis. IVF and infertility and women's health in general, unfortunately, is still sort of in that pattern recognition, I know it when I see it, level of thinking. You think of a lot of our big diagnoses, preeclampsia, endometriosis, infertility. Infertility is not as well characterized, well specified as it should be. And this carries over into just a non-specific way that we treat it. This is exacerbated by the way we do IVF. Each lab being sort of its own artisanal kitchen, having its own individual vocabulary, its own processes, its own means of keeping track, and its own metrics. Within the field itself, there's very few things that we can measure. We can measure fertilization, we can measure various parts of development to blast, we can measure implantation, we can measure birth. But the field is desperately in need of a process optimization, a layering on of an engineering sensibility on top of the science that we do. We need more things to measure, we need more data. And in so doing, we're going to be able to start isolating single variables and very reliably picking out what works and what doesn't. In the meantime, we just kind of, in a way, we do our best. Now, looking further at where IVF lives within the healthcare system, IVF is actually in a very unique place within the United States healthcare system. It's one of the few areas left of, for want of a better term, retail medicine. Almost all of healthcare in this country exists in a scenario where you've got enormous healthcare systems, hospital, the University of Pennsylvania healthcare system, for example, negotiating with Cigna and Aetna and United Health, enormous insurers, to take care of vast numbers of people. It's good for the IVF world to live outside of that. It's good for our patients because it's much more transparent what the charging and what the pricing is. People don't come out of an IVF cycle with surprise bills and things of that sort. It also relieves the IVF programs from having to support financially the kind of overbearing administrative burden that you see in these big hospital these hospital systems. And it also, for good, for bad, or for neutral, it replaces the way the in vitro fertilization industry finances itself. Most of the healthcare system is financed by the hospital systems themselves using retained earnings. IVF is financed by itself and recently supplemented by private equity capital. And we'll get into the ramifications of that. And finally, mirroring the country-to-country difference, the state-to-state difference makes pricing in IVF very, very confusing. Overall, we've got what we call an oligopolistic competition model, where for a given locale, whether it's the New York metropolitan area, the Bay Area, or whatever, there's competition on everything except price. State to state, you've got inconsistent state mandates, some of which have good incentives, some of which have poor incentives, but all of which usually result in some decrease in costs. But most importantly for the future, we have in the past an absence of employer-based insurance coverage, an absence that's now changing, which is going to be an extremely disruptive part of this industry. Now, if you'd asked me about 2011, 2012, if IVF was an interesting area to invest in, an interesting area as a business, an interesting area to launch a fund supporting, and I would have said no. It was an industry that was pretty much in equilibrium. It was doing great scientific work. It was helping many patients. It was growing relatively slowly, but every business, all the programs were relatively busy. They were all pretty much all good businesses, but there was nothing disruptive. Now, there's a cliche in the investment world that we want to go in and disrupt industries. When in reality, what we want to do is we want to find industries that are disrupting themselves. And up until 2012, the IVF industry wasn't really disrupting itself. That has changed. Starting in 2012, egg freezing was no longer experimental. So we had a new bolus, a new group, a new indication for patients to come into the system. About 2012, the private equity industry accelerated its investment in the industry, and there were different reasons for that. A few years later, the government got involved, and the VA, thankfully, and shout out to Resolve for making this happen. The VA now covers IVF for service-related injuries. But then the single two most important disruptions, things that I think have largely gone unnoticed, are the rise in employer-based IVF coverage and what will be the ripple effects from the reversal of the single-child policy in China, which is the single-child policy which created an entire generation of secondary infertility that's still plaguing that country. So I want to take a pause here, having defined where the industry may be at a bit of a pivot point with some new disruptors in it. We've done some tremendous work over 40 years since the first IVF baby. But I want to pose a provocative question. That is, what if the first 40 years of IVF was really just the preliminary? What if the ultimate use of IVF in the world to treat infertility and other reasons is a quantum or two higher than what it is now? And what if we're looking at an industry that's going to be drastically different in the next few years? And I want to address that next. Now, for the moment, let's turn the US IVF industry into one company, a single company. Let's say IVF, private equity consolidation has just gone on steroids, and we've made the entire industry into one company. That would only be the 600th biggest company in the United States. It would only be the 60th largest healthcare company. But as a company, if we were the board of directors of that company, the first question after we approve last board meeting's minutes would be, okay, where's our growth coming from? And maybe now is a good time to proactively choose, where is our growth as an industry going to come from? So if I had a personal input into this, I would recommend to the people in this room that it's not a bad time to think big. Let's think a little bit, that old cliche of out of the box, but let's think about a much larger arena that we could be entering within healthcare, and then make a conscious decision as to whether we want to do that. So instead of the small population of infertility patients that we're treating now, what would it take to build an IVF infrastructure that could take care of every single patient with infertility and every patient with recurrent pregnancy loss? Number two, what if we decided as a field to own genetic disease prevention using IVF? And we've been able to do this for 25 years, but for a lot of good reasons, none of them evil, but it's kind of gotten shunted to the side. What would it take for us to be able to, to really grab that by the horns and make it a big part of what we do? And third, why don't we decide proactively how we're going to manage proactive fertility management, the next potential great wave of preventive medicine? I'm going to use the term social egg freezing or elective egg freezing only once, because in reality those are healthcare. This is not consumer discretionary. But egg freezing is really part of a bigger entity, including oncofertility, the preservation of cancer patients, as well as giving the LGBTQ community the ability to, from the start, plan out their pregnancy history and plan out their fertility. Well, it sounds like a tall order. So what is the addressable market? What are we talking about if we're going to undertake things like this? Well, let's start with the infertility population. And let's build a population-based IVF capacity model. We have 330 million people living in the United States, and we create 6 million pregnancies per year. Unique to the US, half of those pregnancies are planned, half of them are unplanned. We have about a 15% pregnancy loss rate and 4 million births per year. Now, I'm going to make the simplifying assumption that all of our infertility comes from the planned pregnancies and not the unplanned pregnancies. You can argue that point, but it helps us build the model simply. So we're dealing with a population of 2.45 million planned and desired pregnancies. If we apply our standard 15% infertility, we come up with 368,000 new cases of infertility per year in the United States. Now, 368,000 cases of infertility is not going to equate to 368,000 IVF cycles, because not every cycle will result in a pregnancy. But if we apply, if we're building an ideal scenario here, let's take some of the best statistics we get from the best programs. Approximately 65% birth rate for an optimal embryo, and an approximately 78% probability of getting an optimal embryo. It takes us to 725,000 IVF cycles to replace all the infertility for 1 year in the US. Now, it seems like a big number, but let's stress test it a little bit. That 368,000 babies would be 9.2% of the babies that are born in the country, which is high, but it's about the same as Denmark. So there's a precedent for that. And the 725,000 cycles would be the same rate per capita as Spain. So these are not outlandish numbers. Let's move to genetic disease prevention. Now here, these are patients that may have had an affected baby. You had a baby die at age 3 for spinal muscular atrophy. Every one of those couples should be counseled that we can take the risk of a recurrence to that down from 25% to 0 by doing IVF for pre-implantation genetics. We have enormous numbers of patients undergoing preconceptual screening, and greater numbers of people are sending their saliva samples to consumer testing agencies, all of whom will become aware of risk for genetic disease. Some of them will choose to go right to IVF to try to get pregnant. Some of them will choose to freeze a cohort of oocytes and get pregnant later on. Some of them will choose to have their entire families screened so that the family as a whole can decide how they wanted to manage the risk for their pregnancies. You think of the families that have BRCA1 and 2 mutations and high risk for breast and ovarian cancer, and they're playing kind of a 50-50 roulette as to whether they have this risk. Having the female, having the women in the family tested gives them the opportunity to take that risk down to zero. So if we add up 6 indications alone, cystic fibrosis, Fragile X, sickle cell, SMA, autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease, and BRCA1 and 2, that's 60,000 more IVF cycles that we could do and take the incidence of these diseases way, way down. And then to proactive fertility management. Again, oncofertility, LGBTQ, and proactive fertility management. Oncofertility, there's 45,000 cases of cancer in the 0 to 29-year-old age group. And you can make the very good argument that every single one of these cases, unless it's a family that has finished their child rearing, should be given immediately as part of their treatment a fertility preservation program. There's really no excuse for us not doing this. We save someone's life. We want to restore their life and keep them able to have families later on. So what kind of cycle volume are we looking at for this large proactive fertility management group? Well, we said 45,000 cycles for oncofertility. LGBTQ, this is my least well-modeled part. I keep looking up and it seems to be 4% of the population being LGBTQ. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I just applied that to the 2.4 million planned pregnancies, and that's 96,000 pregnancies a year. And if we look at the egg freezing component, 2017 we did about 11,000 cycles. It's growing at 25% per year. By 2027, that takes us to about 100,000. So add that all up, that's another 244,000 cycles per year. Add that to our 725,000 for infertility, 100,000 for recurrent pregnancy loss, brings us to 1.129 million IVF cycles per year in the United States. So I've just increased your volume by 4.5%. So that's a good thing. So I'm going to ask you to take the average $20,000 cost of IVF and give me a 10% discount down to $18,000. That'll define the revenue from this industry in the United States as $20.34 billion. Okay, that's a big number. I may have lost a few, but let's stress test that number too. Operationally, what do we need to do to get there? Well, right now we've got 460 IVF centers doing 600 cycles a year. We need to go to 500 cycles doing 2,000 cycles to hit 1 million cycles. There are already programs in the United States doing over 2,000 cycles. So we have the capability of building out that size. Average RE needs to go to 1,000 cycles that they're overseeing per year, which is a lot. We need strategies to leverage our facilities, leverage our doctors, our nurses, our embryologists, in particular our genetic counselors. We have one genetic counselor for every 80,000 people in this country. If we're going to prevent all that genetic disease using IVF, we need to leverage that. So we need to enter an entrepreneurial model. We need to invent stuff. We need a combination of technology, redistribution of labor, automation of routine tasks, changes in the way we communicate with our patients in order to bring this about. It's doable though. This is what disruptive industries do. Now there's really 2 models that we can follow. One model would be let's just build a larger version of what we've got. And that may be the best model. Or we may decide that we want to build a parallel system, maybe a less high touch, maybe less expensive, more automated, more computerized system as we move forward. Now, how about the cost savings? How are we financing that $20.34 billion? Well, the genetic side, it's remarkable the cost savings that we're going to generate by preventing disease. I'm going to give a couple of examples. Cystic fibrosis if a couple's at risk for having a child with cystic fibrosis, they have that 1 in 4 chance the child is born with cystic fibrosis. It's a chronic illness. There's no cure. The child would be under care for his or her entire life. The most recent medications developed for cystic fibrosis cost upwards of $300,000 per year, every year. And this is to make the symptoms less bad. This is not curative. Layered on top of that are all the emergency room visits, the hospitalizations for pulmonary infections. Cystic fibrosis is a bad actor. So $25,000 for an IVF cycle, take the cystic fibrosis risk down to 0, or take a 1 in 4 probability of having a child with cystic fibrosis and look at these costs. And of course, I'm kind of assuming away the pain and suffering, which is equally, if not more important, but we're talking cost right now. Spinal muscular atrophy is another very good example. For a long time, there was nothing for it. It's a horrible neurodegenerative disease that affects children. A few years ago, there was a drug approved by the FDA that slows down the degeneration, and it costs $375,000 per year. It's not curative. Now, this past year, for the first time, a gene therapy was approved by the FDA to cure spinal muscular atrophy, spinal muscular atrophy type 1. It cost billions of dollars to develop. The company that developed it was bought by Novartis for almost $8 billion. And it's available for children as long as you catch them before the age of 2. And the cost of the single injection is $2.1 million. So again, we're talking about really remarkable differences in the pharmaco and the healthcare economics between preventing these diseases and then treating them. Not to mention, we're giving parents the opportunity to relieve their children of all the pain and suffering of having these diseases. If you want one more financial metric, look to the right side of the slide. 4 numbers. We talk about gene therapy, which is, I do a lot of investing in the biotechnology world. Gene therapy is quote unquote hot. It's an area that's attracting a tremendous amount of capital. And we have 2 companies here with market valuations of upwards of $4 billion and 2 acquisitions of market caps of close to $9 billion. These 4 numbers by themselves, representing 4 companies, each going after one disease, represent more spending the entire world IVF economy. The entire revenue generated by the world IVF is approximately $19 billion. These 4 transactions were $24, $25 billion. So thinking, let's accelerate US IVF to $20 plus billion doesn't seem quite so crazy. Now, how do we scale up disease prevention? It's not simple. It's probably a matter of awareness, creating new patient supply chains, new referral patterns, probably a lot of grand rounds. Got a shout out to my academic home. Columbia University has just started a program for the prevention of genetic disease aimed at using IVF for the sole purpose of disease prevention. Nice work on their part. I'm very happy they've let me lend my name to this as well. And one last comparison, and this one is really illustrative, not only for comparing these 2 fields, but the spending within them. Let's compare oncology with the IVF world. And it seems like an odd comparison at first, like one is cancer and one is fertility. But if you dig deep down into it, they're not that different. Typically, cancer patients and fertility patients will be treated for between 1 and 12 years. Treatment consists of intense times of very, very heavy treatment followed by periods of rest and watching and waiting. Both are extremely disruptive. Both are really end normal life as you know it. The patients themselves could not be more highly motivated. The families cannot be more affected. And there's 15 million oncology patients in the United States, and there's 7 million infertility patients in the United States. We spend about $5 billion a year taking care of the infertility patients. And in 2012, we spent $95 billion taking care of the cancer patients. Now, I don't begrudge a penny of spending on cancer care. I think it's incredible. And frankly, that 95 billion is now well up over 100 billion. But just looking at the difference in what we dedicate in terms of resources to cancer care and reproductive care, these are two extremely, if there's the foundation of life, having children, having a family is at least deserves to be in the same conversation as oncology. And it is in the same conversation, but we just don't spend as much. So what kind of solutions do we have? When I say solutions, here I'm going to get to the down and dirty business sense. Let's go to the dark side of healthcare for a little bit. And I'm going to simplify the world to two tracks. There's a private equity track and there's the venture capital track. Now, private equity invests in profitable companies. They measure something called cash flows. Think of if you win the lottery and the prize for the lottery is a $1,000 check each week in your mailbox for life. And when you win the lottery, they give you a choice. You can either get the check every week or life, or they can give you a single lump sum now. That type of calculation is the basis for private equity investing. How much money is coming in? How much are we willing to spend for it now? So to a private equity firm, every company is a series of lottery ticket payouts. And they just put a valuation on it. Nothing wrong with it. It's a very rational, financially sound way of investing. Venture capital is the opposite. Here we're buying the lottery tickets before we know if they won or not. So you're investing in things that will not make money for a long period of time. So you're willing to put money in, see products get developed with the hope that ultimately you're creating value. And what the IVF industry needs in order to grow is a combination of the two. Now, there's a conversation I have over and over and over again with people in the IVF industry, and it starts with, what do I think of all the private equity money flowing into the IVF world? And then we pause. The second question is, by the way, what's private equity? And there's nothing particularly distinctive about private equity. It's just another source of funds. Traditionally, the IVF world was financed by seed capital from institutions or from founders. And it was later financed by retained earnings of the programs themselves. IVF programs are relatively profitable, so what the programs that have grown have done is they've taken the profits from the IVF center, poured them back into the center, and grown. They've grown by taking on more doctors, setting up satellites, maybe setting up affiliates in other cities. And it's a very rational way for businesses to grow anywhere. Now, over the past 10 years, there's been kind of a perfect storm regarding IVF and private equity. There's been three factors that have gone into private equity entering. One is that, frankly, IVF became profitable enough that the size of the checks the private equity could write were the sizes of checks that they want to write. Private equity likes to invest $30, $40, $100 million at a time. And now we have programs big enough. Secondly, the founders in some of these programs were looking for exits because all of their equity was tied up into the programs themselves. And third, there was a series of private equity investments in other areas of medicine, veterinary medicine, dentistry, clinical laboratories, dialysis, that provided a template for doing this. And to the extent that private equity is investing in good clinics, allowing them to expand, allowing them to propagate the closest to best practices we have, making it more likely that everyone coming up with a good embryo has a 65% chance of having a baby, then the entrance of private equity has been an unequivocal good in terms of patient care. So private equity, in terms of pushing the industry along, is a great thing. It's not going to expand the industry, however. Private equity tends to consolidate industries and bring about efficiencies. To expand the industry, we talked before about we need to become more data-centric, we need to develop technology, we need to layer engineering on top of our science, we need to process optimize. And this comes out of the venture capital world. And there's almost no venture capital in IVF. One of the reasons that the oncology industry has accelerated as rapidly as it has grown the way it has, is because it's got a very well-defined angel to investor to public market strategy. It makes it very easy to invest. Venture capital as yet does not. It doesn't mean it won't always. So, we are, I think, in a pivot point in terms of IVF as a business. There are some underlying trends coming, and maybe I'm overstating them, but in my estimation, we're not really thinking about these enormous new patient populations that are coming into our arena, coming to test the bounds and the capacity of the IVF infrastructure. And we need to start planning for it for the future. I do have some predictions for the future, some of which will prove maybe right, some of which won't. In terms of the consolidation of the industry, that is going to continue. And as it happens, there's going to be an increasing attention to identifying best practices in order to ensure that everyone has an optimal probability of conceiving each time. Those best practices will remain elusive until we generate new metrics, new things to measure, and new things to use for our process optimization. There ultimately will be the emergence of a big insurer, big program duopoly, like we see in the rest of healthcare within the IVF world, as some of these companies that are doing large-scale insurance, gain greater traction. It won't be individual patients seeking care at big programs. It'll be more of a one-to-one interaction that will affect cost. There's going to be an acceleration in technology, a lot of it coming out of the United States, a lot of it coming out of China. China is extremely focused on very rapidly proliferating IVF in their country. And they are very tech savvy, and a lot of things that they invent there are going to make their way here and may be very disruptive. One of the areas we need to be very conscious of is genetic counseling. We are really poor in the people that do it are phenomenal. Our genetic counselors are amazing. But we only have one genetic counselor for every 80,000 people. If we're going to be doing the type of genetic disease prevention we'd like to, we need to find to scale that up. My biggest prediction, sometime in the next 10 years, as IVF continues to grow and expand, that big hospital system is going to attempt to reabsorb the IVF world, to bring it back in. The IVF industry is too profitable, it's going to be too efficient, and these big hospital systems have too much overhead. So you're going to find that competing with investor groups, competing with the consolidation of the large IVF centers, big hospitals are going to attempt to reestablish their footprint in the IVF industry. And finally, a shout out to the single most important input into IVF before, IVF now, and IVF in the future. It will always be the IVF nurses that make this work. So treat your IVF nurse as well. And on that note, I thank you for the platform, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time. Okay.
So in plenary sessions, the tradition is not to take any questions. I'm sure Dr. Sable will be available up here by the podium. So on behalf of the Society, David, thank you very much for that enlightening and frightening lecture. I'm inspired. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.